Kevin Malone spent 9 seasons being the punchline, the slow guy, the fat jokes, the guy who dropped chili on the office carpet, and somehow that became one of the most quoted moments in the entire show. And for 9 seasons we laughed, because why wouldn't we? He talked slow. He thought slow. He misspelled words on purpose for a website. He was the human equivalent of a sad trombone sound effect. But here's the thing that changed everything for me when I actually sat down and traced his entire arc from episode 1 to the finale. What if Kevin Malone isn't actually slow at all? What if the dumbest guy in the office is, underneath all of it, one of the most quietly devastated people in the entire building? Not because he's secretly a genius hiding his intelligence for laughs. That's not what this is. It's worse than that. It's a guy who used to be sharp, who used to have real promise, and who slowly let himself disappear because disappearing hurt less than trying and failing in front of everyone again. Let's start with the detail that nobody talks about enough. Kevin Malone is an accountant, not a guy who fell into accounting because he had no other options. A guy who studied for it, sat for the exams, and became a certified public accountant in the state of Pennsylvania. That is not a small thing. That requires actual sustained intelligence, actual discipline, actual long-term focus. The same guy who can't seem to finish a sentence without losing the thread can apparently master tax law and financial statements well enough to pass a licensing exam most people fail multiple times. Sit with that for a second, because once you know that, every single dumb Kevin moment in the show starts looking less like a character trait and more like a performance. And I think the performance starts with the gambling. This is the part that genuinely broke something open for me. Kevin Malone has a documented, serious gambling addiction. We see it play out across multiple seasons, but the show treats it almost entirely as comedy. He bets on everything. He loses constantly. At one point, he loses so much money that he has to liquidate basically everything he owns just to cover what he owes, and instead of getting help, instead of anyone in that office sitting him down and asking if he's okay, it becomes a storyline about him hiding cash in a chili pot. The thing that's actually devastating about that episode, the chili spill, the one everyone quotes, the one that became a meme before memes were even a fully formed concept, is that almost nobody clocks what's actually happening underneath it. That chili wasn't just chili. That was Kevin's entire emergency fund, his safety net, the thing standing between him and total financial collapse, and he watched it hit the floor in slow motion in front of the entire office. And what did the office do? They laughed. Michael made a joke about it. The cameras kept rolling like it was just another bit. Nobody asked Kevin if he was okay. Nobody asked why a grown man was keeping his life savings in a crockpot instead of a bank, because by that point, nobody in that office expected Kevin to have a real problem. He'd trained them not to. He'd trained all of us not to. And that's the second thing that genuinely messed me up once I started connecting the timeline. There's a theory, and honestly I think it's more than a theory at this point, that Kevin used to be sharper, used to try harder, used to actually care about being taken seriously, and got burned for it. Early on, you catch glimpses. He used to play in a band, Scrantonicity, and when you watch those scenes closely, that's not a guy who's slow. That's a guy who's actually decent at something, who has rhythm, who has a sense of humor that lands when he's not performing the bit version of himself. He keeps the band alive for years on the side, keeps showing up to rehearsals, keeps believing in something that has nothing to do with Dunder Mifflin. And notice what happens whenever the band comes up in conversation at the office. Nobody asks Kevin about it like it matters. It's treated as a quirky little hobby, the same way you'd treat a kid's drawing on a refrigerator. Polite, dismissive, forgotten by the next scene. Now notice what happens whenever Kevin tries to be taken seriously in a context that actually matters, like work. He gets dismissed instantly. Nobody asks his opinion in meetings. Nobody expects competence from him, so when he offers it, it gets treated as a fluke or a joke. There's an episode where Kevin actually catches a financial discrepancy that the entire accounting department missed, a real, legitimate, important catch, and within about 30 seconds, the show moves on like it never happened. Nobody says, wait Kevin, that was actually really smart. It's just absorbed into the noise of the episode and forgotten. Compare that to literally any time Oscar or Angela does competent accounting work. It gets acknowledged. It gets respected. Kevin does the same caliber of work, and the response is silence, or worse, a joke at his expense for even bothering to speak up in the meeting. Here's where I think the real psychology kicks in, and this is the part that genuinely changed how I see this character. When you are consistently dismissed, when your competence gets ignored, and your mistakes get magnified into jokes that follow you around for years, eventually you stop bothering to perform competence at all. It's a documented pattern. Psychologists call it learned helplessness, but it doesn't always look like giving up entirely. Sometimes it looks like leaning all the way into the role people have already decided you play. If Kevin Malone is going to be the dumb guy no matter what he does, no matter how hard he tries, then being the dumb guy on purpose at least gives him some control over the joke. At least then it's his choice. At least then it doesn't sting the same way when he fails, because he wasn't really trying in the first place. You can't be humiliated by failing at something you never attempted. That's the defense mechanism. That's the whole architecture of who Kevin becomes. And once you see that, you start noticing how often Kevin actively chooses the bit over the truth. There's a moment where he deliberately fails a test just so he doesn't have to deal with the pressure of succeeding at something new. There's the infamous moment where he intentionally writes Kevin's world's best chili with misspellings on his food blog because, in his own words, people expect him to spell things wrong, so why disappoint them? Think about how genuinely sad that line is once you take the laugh track out of it. A grown man has decided that the easiest way to survive social interaction is to preemptively lower everyone's expectations of him so far that disappointment becomes literally impossible. He's not protecting his ego by being dumb. He's protecting himself from ever being hurt again by trying and being laughed at anyway. Even the way the show frames his body becomes part of this pattern. There's an entire storyline built around Kevin's weight, around the office pressuring him into a diet, into competing against Oscar in a weight loss contest he never actually asked to be part of. And what happens the moment Kevin starts succeeding? The moment he's actually losing weight and showing real discipline. The narrative undercuts him almost immediately. He gives up. He goes back to the donuts. And the show plays it as a punchline about willpower, about Kevin being Kevin. But look at what's actually happening structurally. Every single time this character starts to show genuine competence, genuine follow-through, genuine pride in something he's accomplishing, the story finds a way to reset him back to the joke. It happens with the accounting. It happens with the band. It happens with the diet. It is not a coincidence repeated that many times. It's a pattern, and once you see the pattern, you start to understand that Kevin isn't just written as dumb. He's written as a character who is not allowed to be anything else. By the writers, by the office around him, and eventually, tragically, by himself. Then there's his relationship history, and this might be the saddest thread of all if you actually follow it through. Kevin marries Stacy. It looks stable for a while, at least on the surface, but underneath it there's a quiet, persistent sense that Kevin is just along for the ride in his own marriage, that the dynamic isn't built on partnership so much as Stacy managing him the way you'd manage a slightly difficult roommate. And when it falls apart, the show treats it like background noise, a divorce mentioned almost in passing, something other characters joke about more than something Kevin is ever allowed to actually grieve on screen. We don't get the version of Kevin sitting alone in his apartment processing the end of his marriage. We get the version of Kevin making a joke about it at his desk so everyone else feels comfortable enough to laugh and move on. That's the pattern with this character every single time something genuinely painful happens to him. The show and the office around him immediately reaches for the joke as a pressure valve, and Kevin, because he's spent his entire life training people to expect exactly that from him, hands them the joke himself before anyone even has to ask for it. He's doing emotional labor for an entire office full of people who barely think about him outside of the punchlines he provides them. He is making everyone else comfortable with his own pain by performing stupidity on demand, and nobody, not Michael, not Jim, not Pam, not Dwight, ever once stops to ask what it's actually costing him to keep doing that. Even his friendships inside the office tell the same story if you actually pay attention. Kevin and Oscar and Angela are framed as a trio, the accounting department, stuck together in a tiny corner of the office for 9 years. But look at the texture of those relationships. Oscar and Angela actually talk to each other, argue with each other, have real opinions about each other's lives. Kevin mostly exists at the edge of that dynamic, tolerated, occasionally mocked, rarely consulted. Angela in particular treats him with a kind of casual contempt for most of the show, openly annoyed by his presence, openly dismissive of anything he says, and the show plays her irritation as comedy rather than what it actually reads as once you strip the laugh track away, which is a coworker who has decided Kevin simply does not matter enough to be taken seriously as a person. And here's where it gets genuinely heartbreaking, because the one relationship in the show where Kevin gets something resembling real, unguarded affection is with Michael Scott. Michael, of all people, the most emotionally stunted boss in the history of television, is somehow the only person in that office who treats Kevin like he matters without conditions attached. Michael includes him. Michael defends him. Michael, in his chaotic, completely inappropriate way, actually seems to like Kevin for exactly who he is rather than tolerating him as comic relief. And when Michael leaves the show, that's not just a loss of a boss for Kevin. That's the loss of the only person who consistently chose him without needing a reason. After Michael's gone, watch how Kevin shrinks even further into the background. Watch how the writers, intentionally or not, basically stop giving him anything resembling depth at all. He becomes pure punchline. The guy who eats out of the vending machine. The guy who can't operate basic technology. The guy whose entire personality, by the final seasons, has been reduced to a collection of bits with no person left underneath them. By the time the finale rolls around, almost every other character gets some kind of meaningful closure. Pam and Jim get their ending. Dwight gets his wedding. Andy gets his redemption arc, messy as it is. Even Creed, who exists in the show as basically a walking mystery, gets a strange little moment of dignity. Kevin gets fired. That's it. That's his arc resolution. He loses his job near the very end of the series for a mistake that, frankly, given everything we now understand about how this man's competence was systematically ignored for 9 years, feels like the final cruel punchline in a story that was never really fair to him in the first place. Nobody in that office throws him a goodbye party. Nobody gives him the emotional send-off they give literally every other character. He just leaves quietly, the same way he spent most of the show being quietly dismissed. He ends up bartending, which the show frames as a kind of comedic downgrade. The accountant turned bartender. Haha, how the mighty have fallen. But watch his face in those final scenes. There's something something almost like relief in it.
Like a man who has finally stopped performing competence for people who were never going to acknowledge it anyway,
and found a room where being warm and funny and a little chaotic is actually enough. And maybe that's the saddest part of the entire Kevin Malone story. Not the gambling, not the marriage, not even the firing. It's that a man who was once sharp enough to become a licensed accountant spent nearly a decade of his life convincing an entire office and an entire audience that he was barely capable of forming a complete sentence because somewhere along the way he learned that being underestimated hurt less than being seen and failing anyway. He built an entire identity out of lowered expectations because nobody ever gave him a reason to believe he deserved higher ones. The tragedy isn't that Kevin Malone was dumb. The tragedy is that he wasn't, and almost nobody in that office or in that audience ever bothered to notice. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to watch more videos in the future, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.